Chapter 5. It was coming up for 3 years since I'd left England. Did I miss it? I'll be honest, apart from not seeing my family as much I'd have liked, no, I didn't. I managed to get home about once a year, and at 22, I'd seen more of the world than most people back home could only dream of: Canada, Germany, Japan, even Hawaii on a couple of occasions. And going to all those places gave me a lot of experience as a wrestler. As long as you keep getting in the ring, you keep learning. The first time I went to Hawaii was in 1981, when I went with Bruce and Keith Hart to wrestle for Peter Maivia's Mid-Pacific Promotions. I flew straight in from a 5-week tour of Japan, where, as I often did because I was a heel over there, I had shaved my head. Peter Maivia took one look and said, "That's too short for a babyface," and made me wrestle in a mask. Hawaii was where I first met a very good friend of mine, Tonga, who later wrestled as King Tonga, then Haku, and later still, as one half of the Islanders tag team. There was a mix of wrestlers in Hawaii. Giant Haystacks was over from England, Peter Maivia's son, Rocky Johnson was wrestling, as well as King Curtis Iorkia and the Steigers, Kurt, and Carl. Anyway, I'd only been on the island a few hours when I got a call from Stu. "Kid, will you come home?" I said, "I'm not being funny, Stu, but I've only just got here." "What's the problem?" The problem was Stu had brought the English wrestler Steve right into the territory for a few weeks, and nobody would wrestle him, not one of them. Like me, Steve had been trained by Ted Beckley, and by a lot of other people who could shoot wrestle. So he knew the job, top to bottom, and now he was being a bastard with everybody, trying to cripple them. I was having trouble with my knee at that time. I'd torn a cartilage in Japan, and could have done with resting it a bit. But, as usual, I said, "Okay, Stu. I'll do it." And 2 days later I was back in Calgary. I went to see Steve, who I knew quite well from wrestling in England, and said, "Steve, look. My knee's bad. Just, take care of me a bit, will you?" He slapped me on the back and said, "Don't you worry, Tommy, I will." So that was that. I thought maybe we'd go in and do a short match, say 10 minutes, because of my leg. Instead, we had a 30-minute draw, and all the way through it, Steve ripped the hell out of my knee. I wrestled him every night for about 30 minutes all that week he was there, and every night, he did the same thing, went straight for my leg. But, that's wrestling. It was nothing personal, and after the matches, we were still good friends. I went back to Hawaii on my own later that year, again, for Peter Maivia. We were wrestling in a big building not far from Pearl Harbor. I would say, full, it could hold about 15,000 people. We had 600. We toured round the islands, Maui, Oahu, but none of them Rio we did any business. At the end of the week Peter said to me, "Come on brah," which is brother in Hawaiian. "I'll buy you a beer." He bought me a great big jug of beer and then handed me an envelope which had my paycheck inside. But before I opened it, he stopped me and said, "Don't worry. It will be better next week." Well, I opened it, and inside was $25. That was my pay for the whole week, for maybe 4 or 5 matches. "Don't worry," Peter said. So I didn't. I flew back to Calgary the next day. Don't get me wrong, I liked Hawaii, and I still have some good friends out there, but that was it. I never wrestled there again. Back on the Stampede circuit, most of the time I was still going head-to-head with Brett, and we were coming up with some really exciting stuff. The first cage match I ever did was with Brett for Stampede. In Calgary we used a wire mesh cage instead of steel bars, which I preferred because it was more flexible and could do a lot more damage when you rubbed your opponent's face into it. We also did a few ladder matches, which added another dimension to our feud. The first one was at the Pavilion, which was taped for the next day's television. The ladder was up in the middle of the ring, with the belt, the British Commonwealth belt, hanging just above. At one point I got Brett in a headlock, he shot me off into the ropes, and I came back with a flying headbutt. Then he moved, or dropped, and I headbutted the ladder. It was a great weapon, and by the end of that match both our heads were pouring with blood, and we were crawling round the ring, more or less selling on our knees. The place was full, and for the last 10 minutes of that match the crowd couldn't stay on their seats. I managed to reach the ladder first and started climbing up for the belt, but then Brett got up and drop-kicked the ladder sideways. I was nearly at the top, and as it tipped over, I was catapulted off, bollocks first, onto the top rope, which got a great reaction from the crowd. And as one feud with Brett finished, I'd start another one with Bruce, and then Keith, and then back to Brett again. I remember talking to Stu one day, and telling him about my cousin back in England, Davey Boy Smith, and how he was coming along. Stu was interested. He knew Ted had trained him, and that he'd had some matches with Giant Haystacks and Big Daddy. Stampede was doing okay, business-wise, and he was always looking out for new faces. So I rang Davey Boy Smith and said, "Dave, how would you like to come out to Calgary?" And as you would imagine, straight away, he said, "Yeah, when?" I said, "Make it for next month, then you won't mess up Max Crabtree's schedule." Stu paid for his air ticket, and when he first arrived in Canada, he moved in with me. Most people assumed, in later years, that because we were first cousins, we'd been close friends from the start. But he was 5 years younger than me, just a kid when I left England. I'd trained in Ted's gym with him, at most, a handful of times, so, no, at first, I didn't know Davey Boy Smith at all. But for the first few months in Stampede, I wrestled him, Dynamite Kid versus Davey Boy Smith. He was the babyface, I was the heel, which straight away caused a bit of a problem for the Hearts. One night Brett came round to my apartment. At that time he had his own place just a couple of blocks away from me, with a worried look on his face, and he said, "Tom, this is a really bad idea, you know." I said, "What do you mean, Brett? We can't have Davey sharing an apartment with you when you're wrestling him every Friday night on TV. Everyone will see what's going on." Well, having him move in with me hadn't been my choice anyway, so I shouted, "Dave, pack your bags. You're moving in with Brett." Not long afterward, Davey Boy Smith was back, knocking on my door, wanting a favor. He said, "Tommy, I want to be big like these other wrestlers." Bear in mind, when he first left England to come to Canada he looked like a matchstick. I said, "Well, you need some steroids." "Yay, but I don't know nobody." That was how he talked then, before he got his American accent. "Well, Dave, I'll give you a couple of shots right now if you want, just to start you off, but don't tell anybody." I drew the stuff up, a thick white liquid, and then I gave him 2 injections, one in each ass cheek. I told him, "This is Winstrol V water-based steroid. I'm giving you 2 cc's in one cheek and 2 cc's in the other." So, off he went, I imagine, feeling very pleased with himself. The next day we had to go to Edmonton, about 200 miles away from Calgary. We used to travel around the loop in an old van, and on this day I made sure I got in the van before Davey. Well, I had to let everybody in on the joke. Then Davey turned up and got in the van, all quiet and shy, as he was back then, and we set off. We'd only been on the road 5 minutes when somebody, it might have been Bruce, started going, "Moo." Somebody else went, "Meow." Davey Boy Smith just sat there, wondering what was going on. The rest of us were falling about laughing, until finally, somebody said, "Davey, you daft bastard, did you not know he injected you with milk?" So that was that. A few months later he started going out with Stu's youngest daughter, Diana, and quite soon afterward, he married her. All in all, I would say Davey Boy Smith had a great time in Calgary. The Hearts took care of him, I took care of him. When he first came over, he would only have been 17 or 18, and looked like a puff of wind would blow him away. I made him look like $1 million in the ring during those first matches, at the expense of myself, because I took all the bumps, all the backdrops, all the back suplexes. But I didn't care. The people enjoyed the matches, and to me, that was all that mattered. He even became a champion for the first time because of me. I was due to go out to Japan for Inoki, and at the time I had a World Championship belt. It wasn't an official world title, but one that the Hearts had come up with after Nelson Royal had kept hold of the NWA Championship belt during Stampede Week. The Hearts knew I was going to be away on tour for 4 or 5 weeks, and they knew that the belt would be left undefended. But they didn't think Davey Boy Smith was up to being the champion. I was wrestling him the night before I was flying out to Tokyo, and just before the match, Bruce said to me, "Just make sure you beat him and leave the belt at home." I thought about it and said, "Okay." We went in the ring, and I tell you, I made the bastard work that night. I bounced him round all 4 corners, threw him out of the ring, suplexed him in the ring, but then he dropped behind me, back suplexed me, went into a bridge and beat me, 1, 2, 3. That was it. He was the champion. And nobody was more surprised than Davey Boy Smith. As you can imagine, back in the dressing room, the Hearts, especially Bruce, were like raging bulls. I just said, "Bruce, I'm going away. You need to use the belt." The truth was, I didn't need to have done it, but I knew it would give Davey Boy Smith's career a good boost. So yes, I looked after my cousin, set him up in Canada, took him to Japan, got him into the WWF, and when I look back, I wonder what made him do the things he did. That same night, there was a knock at the dressing room door. When I opened it, there was this little kid, maybe 12 or 13 years old, standing there. I knew his face because he was always at the Stampede shows. He was a nice enough kid, and he told me he was working out, he showed me his muscles, and he said, "When I'm older, I want to be a wrestler, exactly like you." I said, "Okay, very good." I'm sure a lot of young kids who watched wrestling had ideas about becoming wrestlers. But I had to hand it to that young kid. His name was Chris Benoit, and when he grew up, he became a terrific wrestler. It had been nearly a year since I'd wrestled for New Japan. That second time in Japan had been so different to the first time with the E-Way, so much better. So when Shinwa called me up early in 1981 and asked if I could make it for a tour in the spring, I said yes straight away. I arrived in Tokyo on March 31st and went into a straight 4-week run, Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Yokohama. All the usual places, all sold out. By this time, my little friend from England, Sammy Lee, or Satoru Sayama, was a regular on the New Japan cards. The promoters had some big plans for him. On the last night of the tour, which was at the Sumo Palace in Tokyo, they were relaunching him as a new character, Tiger Mask. And although in my opinion, it was one of the best gimmicks New Japan ever came up with, on that first night, it looked like a load of shit. You see, Shinma, or whoever was supposed to make sure Sayama's Tiger Mask outfit was ready, forgot one thing, the most important thing, the mask. So, on this night, I'd already gone to the ring, and as usual, I was swearing at the crowd, kicking the ropes, and waiting for Sayama, or Tiger Mask, to come out. And when he did, well, I didn't know what to think. The mask was the worst I'd ever seen. It was completely flat to his head, it had no ears, and looked like it had been crayoned on. Worst of all, as he came running down to the ring, the crowd started chanting Sayama. In Japan before the matches, you've probably seen the little ceremony that they have when the Japanese girls come into the ring and present flowers to the wrestlers. Well, Sayama climbed into the ring, and I started pelting him with the flowers, like I always did, but I could see he was upset. He had his hands up to his face and looked as if he was going to cry. Well, I'll be honest, he looked like a prick, but it didn't make any difference to me. We still had a match to wrestle. I said to him, quietly, so nobody could see, "What's the matter?" He mumbled something like, "The mask," and put his head down. So I said, under my breath, "I know. It's the shits." I had some sympathy for him, but there was nothing he could do about it, so I just said, "Oh, shut up and let's get on with it." And we did. We had a great match that night, which probably went about 15 minutes, and the crowd were just going crazy. You have to remember, what I was doing with Sayama was all new stuff for me as well. I'd just about got used to the American style of wrestling, although I could still use a lot of European stuff in my matches, and here was Sayama, just back from Mexico where he'd learned all the fast, high-flying moves, and I had to adapt again. For example, I'd pull him to the turnbuckle, and as he came out of it I'd put him in a backbreaker on my shoulder. From that, he'd land straight on his feet, I'd turn around and, bump, he'd arm drag me straight through the ropes. So I'd be picking myself up from the floor outside the ring, meanwhile, he'd hit the opposite ropes and was running back as if he was going to dive out at me. Sometimes he did. Sometimes he just caught the top or the middle rope and swung himself back into the ring. I never really knew, so the timing had to be bang on. Those matches moved so fast, if you weren't sharp enough, well, somebody could get caught out and hurt. I remember one time when Sayama dived through the ropes so fast I did catch him, but the force of the dive sent us right over the guardrail and into the crowd. I took the brunt of it. In fact, I took all the skin off my back. I can remember lying there in this tangle of feet, and my back felt as if it was on fire. Then all the young boys who'd been crouched around the ring came rushing over and put a load of wet towels on my back. But I still enjoyed the match, and I know the crowd did. So with Sayama, I had to pick up his style very quickly. Our matches were very different to the ones I'd had with Tatsumi Fujinami, but there again, Fujinami had also spent time in Mexico and Florida and Germany when he was younger. So he had adapted to the European style and mixed it with the Japanese style. But, for whatever reason, it did work between us. Sayama was the flyer. I let him do all his high spots, he'd jump and I'd catch. Then I'd get him in the ring and kick the shit out of him, and the people loved it. As usual, I took all the bad bumps. Basically, I took all the wear and tear in those matches with Tiger Mask. We'd both be aching and paining afterward, me, I'm sure, more than him, and looking back, I'm sure it was those matches that were the start of all the injuries I had a few years later. It wasn't just the wrestling styles that were different in Japan, the crowds were different as well. I was going to wrestle a tag match in Sapporo one night with Stan Hansen. Just before we went on, the referee, Peter Takahashi, came to the dressing room. He said, "Tonight you wrestle Choshu." I said, "So what? He is third babyface in this company." "Very good. I'll tell you what I'm going to do to the third babyface of this company, Peter. I'm going to slam him upside down in the corner post and drop an elbow right on his bollocks." He shook his head and started waving his hands about. "No, Tom, you can't do that." I said, "Why not?" He said, "The people will laugh." Now, anywhere else in the world, kicking your opponent in the balls would really get the crowd against you, you know, as in ooh, the bastard. In Japan they'd just laugh, which I thought was really strange. But they liked strong matches, I mean hard physical matches, where the wrestlers connected. All those matches I had with Choshu, who was a hard hitter, Sayama, Kimura. If you look close enough there was no wind between the shots. Don't get me wrong, they paid us well to do that. But like I said before, the price I paid in the long run was a lot higher. All the time I was in Japan, I was picking up a bit more of the language and the way of life over there. I'd heard people talk about the monkey house. I didn't know what it was, but before I finished that tour, I found out. Right at the start, Peter Takahashi said to me, "In the ring, the Japanese are the nice people. You and the other foreigners, you are no good. Understand?" So I said yeah, okay. And he said, "So you must do whatever you want." I said, "What do you mean?" "Go to the ring, but on the way you slap, kick, punch, whatever you want, to the fans." So I thought about this and said, all right. I think I was wrestling Yoshiaki Yatsu this night. He used to be an Olympic wrestler, and he used a lot of submission moves, front face locks and toe holds, and he could hit a bit hard as well. Anyway, I set off for the ring, and as I walked out from behind the curtains, the fans were leaning over the barrier, calling out and patting me on the back. Well, one young lad slapped me a little bit too hard. So I remembered what Peter had said, I turned round, grabbed him, he was just a kid, and dragged him over the barrier. I ripped all his clothes off, knocked him to the floor, and kicked him in the mush. Then I left him lying there in his underpants and carried on walking to the ring, while the rest of the fans were going nuts. I got in the ring, as usual, spotted the Mafia men on the front row, with their smart suits and dark glasses, nice enough people as long as you didn't bother them, and waited for Yatsu to come in. We wrestled a good match, not what you would call fast-paced, but a good solid fight. But when it was finished, before I got back to the dressing room, I could see the police were waiting for me. I think they must have turned up while I was in the ring, but I imagine Inoki or Shinma said, "Please can you wait until he's finished his match before you arrest him?" Well, they couldn't really come down to the ring and arrest me in the middle of it. There was a lot of shouting and arguing in Japanese, then one of the policemen said to me, "You play monkey, you go to monkey house." So they arrested me, took me down to the police cells and left me all by myself. None of them spoke much English, and I sat there wondering what was going to happen. I don't know if I'd been set up exactly, although I had a good idea at the time that I was, but I just thought, I'll do it anyway, get a bit of time off, something to eat, and bollocks to it. Well, I'm not being funny, but I got an apple, a bit of rice and some green tea. And after 3 days, somebody, probably Inoki, paid to get me out. And I still got my guarantee, even though I missed 2 nights of wrestling. When I got out, the story was all over the newspapers, making me out to be this terrible person. So, you can imagine what that did for business. All I'm saying is whatever the company paid to get me out, they definitely got their money back. When I got back from Japan, Davey was round straight away wanting to know all about it. He wanted to know what the money was like, what the chances were for him. Well, I knew he wasn't ready for Japan, not yet. I said, "Don't be in such a big hurry. When you're ready to go to Japan, I'll take you with me." Anyway, a few months after that he rang me up and said, "Tommy, I'm going to Japan. I've got 1 night with New Japan." I said, "Dave, don't do it. Wait till I go over again and I'll get you a good deal." But he didn't listen. He went out there for a week, wrestled 1 match against the Cobra, and had to wear a mask. At first the people thought it was me and were chanting "Ki-do, Ki-do," and then he took the mask off. They paid him $1,000, and when he got back, feeling all clever with himself, I said, "You stupid prick. I could have got you twice as much." When I eventually did take him to Japan with me, I did get him a good deal, and he was happy with it, until he found out that it was less money than me. But apart from that, I had better things to think about than Davy Boy Smith being a stupid bastard. A short-tempered bastard called Dave Schultz had just come into the territory. Dave, or Dr. D, as he was known, was from Tennessee, and he could be a bit funny with the other wrestlers. Most of them were scared of him because he was handy and could take care of himself. If anyone messed up a spot and ended up hurting him, even a little bit, he'd put them away right after the match. So a lot of wrestlers didn't want to get in the ring with him. We were in Medicine Hat, Alberta, doing a spot show. In the middle of the match I accidentally caught Dave on the side of the face with a knee drop or something. We carried on wrestling, but I could tell he was mad. After the match he came storming into the dressing room and said, to me, that was how he talked, "If you wanna play them kind of fucking games, I'll play them right back." Then he turned round and walked out. Everybody else sat there, not saying anything, pretending to look the other way, so I got up and walked after him, straight into his dressing room. I heard somebody say, "Oh, Schultz is going to do Dynamite now." I said, "What's wrong with you?" "Look, accidents do happen, Dave. What's the crack here altogether? You get a little fucking love tap and you're upset over that. A man of your size." Well, I think Dave Schultz was a bit surprised by this. He just stared at me, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing, and then he said, to me, "We're friends." "You're right. Anybody can make a mistake." I just said, "Thank you." And I walked out. It was just as Ted had always told me, win, lose or draw, you never step back, always forward. Anyway, not too long after that he was in a cage match with Leo Burke. Just before the match, David said to me, "If something goes wrong out there, I want you to give me a hand." I said, "Okay, Doc." Well, something did go wrong for Dave, and Leo Burke had him on his back, and was about to pin him. So I ran up the aisle, climbed right to the top of the cage and from 20 feet up, without stopping to think, I dove off with a flying knee drop. Bloody hell, it was a long way down. Before I landed, Leo rolled out of the way, and I ended up dropping the knee from 20 feet, straight into Dave Schultz's ribs. I thought, oh Christ. Then, easy as anything, Leo Burke rolled back and pinned him 1, 2, 3. But you know what? Dave Schultz, who would have knocked the shit out of anybody else in a second if they'd done that to him, never said a word. And it was only back in the dressing room that I realized how dangerous that 20-foot knee drop could have been. I'd never done anything like that before. But once I had done it, I started doing other risky moves. I just didn't think, it was whatever came to me at the time. For example, I was the first man to take another man and suplex him off the top turnbuckle. The very first time I did it was to a Japanese wrestler called Masa Fuji. I didn't plan to do it. I just found myself up there on the top with Fuji, and the idea just came to me that a suplex from there would be a great way to finish. It was an incredible move that first time, and the whole crowd, thousands of people, went oh. Like they couldn't believe it. I know a lot of wrestlers do that move now, and other things that I'm sure are a lot riskier, but that one, the superplex. I did it first. New Japan called Stu up again at the end of that year to see if I was available for a tour at the start of 1982. Stu came to an agreement with New Japan, they could have me, as long as they took Brett as part of the deal. What I didn't know at that time was that Stu also negotiated himself a booking fee from New Japan to compensate him for what he lost in takings at home. Personally, I didn't care whether Brett came or not. We were getting along fine, our matches, in my opinion, were some of the best that the Canadian fans had seen in a long time. Plus we'd met a couple of girls out in Regina, Saskatchewan, and as it happened, they were sisters, Julie and Michelle. So, no, it didn't bother me having Brett along, in fact we were having a great time, and between us, we got up to a few pranks as well. We were in Sapporo one night, me, Brett, Freddie Blassie, and Rick McGraw, who you might remember as Quick Draw McGraw. Peter Takahashi was there as well. Peter used to act as the translator for the Americans who couldn't speak any Japanese. For example, when they went out to a restaurant, he'd order the food for them. Anyway, after we'd been for something to eat, Peter and Fred went back to their hotel room, while we stayed and had a few more drinks with Rick. He was hitting the sake, strong Japanese wine, and by the end of the night he was well out of it. We got back to the hotel, got Rick's kimono from his room, and got him to dress up as a sumo wrestler, wearing nothing but the kimono wrapped round his ass. I found a wheelbarrow and we stuck Rick in it. There was nobody on reception, so one of us, probably me, rang Peter and Freddie in their rooms. I said, "Fred, there's something wrong." It must have been about a arm and Fred was half asleep. He said, "Dynamite. Is that you?" "Yay, it's me. But you'd better come down? Rick's acting funny. I think he might try and do something stupid." "What do you mean?" I said, "I'm telling you he's off his head." Fred said, "Okay, I'll be right down." I rang Peter, told him the same story, and then we pushed the wheelbarrow, with Rick in it, into the lift and sent it up to the 6th floor where we knew Fred and Peter would be waiting to get the lift down. And when the lift doors opened all they would see was Rick in the wheelbarrow, wearing a diaper, and with a big stupid grin on his face. Next day, he couldn't remember a thing. On that tour in December 1981, we wrestled some tag matches against Tiger Mask and Kuniaki Kobayashi, and I had a lot of singles with Tiger Mask, with Brett as my manager. There was one Japanese wrestler called Hoshino, who always wanted to be the big hero in the ring. Well, the little prick was only 5'4" anyway. We wrestled a singles match one night, and all the way through he kept trying it on with me, so in the end, I just opened up on him. Which he didn't like. He had me in a corner, he stuck a grovet on me, and said, under his breath, "You shoot." A grovet is a front face lock, an old Wigan move anyway, but when it's put on you properly, forget it. He would have learned how to put a grovet on from Karl Gotch, I'm sure. But one thing that I learned from the short time I was at Riley's gym, was how to get out of one. I reached across for his left elbow and wrenched hard. It took him by surprise, and nearly took one of his fingers off. The next night, me and Brett were wrestling Tiger Mask and Hoshino in a tag match. Before we went to the ring, Sayama came to me and said, "Tommy, no trouble tonight, please." Anyway, Tiger Mask started the match off with Brett, and after a few minutes they both went for the tag at the same time. As Hoshino turned round and saw that I was in the ring, he went straight back and made another quick tag. He definitely didn't want a part of me that night. It was around this time that Tatsumi Fujinami moved up to the heavyweight division and vacated the NJPW WWF Junior title. So now there were a few of us, myself, Tiger Mask, Kobayashi, Kimura, and a few Mexican wrestlers, all in contention for the belt. To be honest, Fujinami could have moved up a long time ago, but when he went, in my opinion, it was because the company had much bigger plans for Tiger Mask. He was doing great business for them, and you know, it was a shame that New Japan never really gave Sayama the credit he deserved for bringing that business in. But, on New Year's Day 1982, he did become the NJPW WWF Junior Heavyweight Champion, courtesy of the Dynamite Kid.